The Galactic Council Hall buzzed with excitement as the long-awaited event, Culture Share 3000, finally began. Delegates from over 100 intelligent species had gathered to share the most treasured pieces of their homeworlds. Songs made of light, dances performed in zero gravity, sculptures carved from stardust. Every presentation was unique and peaceful, a true celebration of unity across the stars. When it was Earth's turn, the humans stepped forward with confident smiles. They hadn't brought an opera, a painting, or a holographic poem. Instead, they offered a film, a motion picture they described as iconic, thrilling, and emotionally engaging. The title alone made some aliens curious. The Shadows Below. The humans explained it was a form of entertainment called horror, which caused a bit of confusion. "Is that like a sad documentary?" asked a jellyfish-like creature from Gliesa 71. The humans only grinned and said, No, just wait. It's better with popcorn." So, the council chamber was transformed into a dark theater, and various species took their seats, most of them unfamiliar with human cinema. Ambassador Threx from the Cephalian Collective, known across the galaxy for his deep emotional sensitivity and telepathic mind, sat in the center, excited to understand Earth's art. The lights dimmed. The film began. At first, it was quiet. Just a dark forest, the wind moving through empty trees. A soft violin played. Some delegates leaned in, waiting for the story to start. Then a sudden flash of movement appeared on screen, a pale hand reaching from a cracked door, followed by a sound that made even the bravest aliens flinch. A scream so real and sharp, it felt like it cut through their minds. Threx gasped and covered his frontal lobes with both hands. A small creature from the Venusian rings rolled into a ball and hummed loudly to calm itself. The screen continued. A group of humans exploring an abandoned house, discovering symbols on the wall, hearing footsteps upstairs when no one else was home. The fear built slowly but deeply. Cephalian hearts began to beat faster. Even those who didn't have traditional hearts began to panic, their biology reacting to the rising tension in a way they had never experienced before. The jump scares came next. A face appeared in the ASCII mirror. A door slammed behind the characters. A character whispered, "We're not alone." And then, silence. For 10 seconds, the screen was black. The silence stretched just long enough to become unbearable. The aliens sat frozen, breathless, their eyes glowing in alarm. Then the creature appeared, crawling upside down through a narrow hallway, and several delegates screamed out loud. One alien from the floating cities of Zarnax fainted and had to be gently carried out by their companions. Ambassador Threx was visibly shaking, trying to understand why humans would create such an experience. "Is this a warning from their history?" he whispered. But no, the humans were watching calmly, even smiling at each other. "This is the best part," one of them said. That sentence alone terrified a dozen alien species. As the film progressed, some delegates tried to leave quietly, overwhelmed by the strange mix of fear, tension, and suspense. The humans offered to stop the movie, but Threx, in an act of bravery, or possibly confusion, insisted it should continue. "For cultural understanding," he said, though his voice was trembling. By the time the credits rolled and the lights came back on, the room was silent. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that follows something no one fully understands. One alien was hugging itself, whispering, "The shadows, the basement, the eyes in the dark." Ambassador Threx stood up, slowly, his expression blank. "That was unlike anything I've ever known," he said. "And humans call this fun?" The humans nodded, proudly. Threx didn't speak, again for the rest of the day. The council quietly called an emergency session later that evening, and for the first time in years, they discussed whether Earth's art needed to come with a warning label. 15 minutes into the shadows below, the Galactic Council's theater had turned into a battleground for composure. Ambassador Threx, of the Cephalian Collective, who was known for his telepathic sensitivity and emotional depth, felt his mind being pulled in strange directions. His cranial tendrils twitched in response to the mounting terror on the screen. Each new scene seemed to pierce his calm demeanor like a needle, injecting pure fear into his consciousness. He was vibrating now, not from excitement, but from shock. His normally unshakable self-control faltered as the atmosphere grew heavier. Nearby, the amphibian delegate from Krylax, who had once proudly shared tales of surviving hostile planetary environments, was reduced to a trembling heap of gelatinous form. His body collapsed, liquefying into a puddle of distress as the terror on the screen overwhelmed him. Across the room, a sentient cloud being from the Nebula Choir, usually composed and serene, evaporated itself in a desperate attempt to avoid further exposure to the horror. Its gaseous form swirled in frantic agitation, its molecules scattering in sheer panic. The room was in chaos. The once majestic council theater now felt like a cage, closing in around them. The humans, who had been so sure of their film's ability to impress, watched in stunned silence as their fellow galactic representatives lost control. The human audience sat motionless, confused by the mass exodus of terrified delegates, the screams echoing in their ears. "Wait until the basement scene," one of them whispered under their breath, trying to ease the tension with a sense of humor that only made the situation feel even stranger. It was at that moment that the infamous jump scare hit. The screen flickered, and a low, spine-chilling sound filled the air as the lead character in the film descended into a pitch-black basement. The entire room seemed to collectively hold, its breath bracing for what was to come. Without warning, a twisted figure lunged from the shadows. The creature's hollow, haunting scream tore through the quiet, sending shockwaves of terror through the audience. The effects were instant and catastrophic. Several delegates, already at their breaking point, bolted from their seats. They rushed toward the exits, but in their panic, they tripped over each other in a mess of limbs and confusion. Some slammed into walls, others collided with chairs, and the room was filled with desperate, frantic movements. Emergency droids were deployed at once, their mechanical voices calling for order as they attempted to manage the overwhelming panic. Lights blinked on, flooding the room with artificial brightness, but the damage was done. The once composed delegates were now completely unhinged. There was no recovery from the shock they had experienced. Threx, who had always been a picture of calm wisdom, was visibly shaken, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. This is madness." The humans, now thoroughly baffled by the scene unfolding before them, tried to explain. But their attempts felt out of place. How could they possibly explain that this was entertainment? That fear, pure and raw, was what they had enjoyed for generations? "It's just a movie," one human said, trying to offer an explanation, but the words hung in the air awkwardly. "We thought you'd find it. Spooky fun?" The room fell silent, save for the deep breaths of the distressed delegates. The Cephalian ambassador, struggling to regain his composure, took a deep breath before responding. "Was this entertainment?" he asked, his voice trembling. This is not something we should be watching." His words, while spoken softly, were filled with an emotion that every being in the room could sense. The humans stood motionless, unsure of how to respond. For them, horror was something that could be enjoyed, shared, even laughed at. But for these delicate and emotionally sensitive species, it was something far worse. A nightmare that had shattered their sense of security. The aliens, still reeling from the experience, looked at each other with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Why would you create this?" they murmured, as though they couldn't fathom the intention behind it. The humans, despite their earlier confidence, now felt a deep sense of shame. This was not what they had expected. What had started as an innocent offering of their culture had now become an intergalactic disaster, leaving the Council unsure of how to proceed. Would they banish humanity's films from the galaxy forever? Or would they attempt to understand this strange, terrifying art form that had left an entire species trembling in its wake? In the wake of the chaos caused by the shadows below, the Galactic Council was in an uproar. Emergency meetings were held, and a full debriefing was scheduled in the Council's medical wing. Within hours, a newly formed department was established, the Cognitive Recovery and Human Exposure Therapy Division. This division's sole purpose was clear: to help the traumatized aliens recover from what could only be described as the greatest shock to their minds they had ever experienced. Beings from across the galaxy who had experienced the film were rushed into therapy, their minds struggling to process the raw emotions and horror they had just witnessed. The Cephalian delegates, usually so calm and serene, were now undergoing intense sessions with specialists to help them rebuild their emotional barriers. The amphibians from Krillax, whose gelatinous forms had almost collapsed in fear, were receiving restorative treatments to rebuild their confidence. Even the Nebula Choir's sentient cloud being, which had evaporated itself in a state of distress, had to undergo calming regimens to stabilize its gaseous structure. The therapists were working around the clock, desperately trying to undo the damage done by a single human movie. But no one was more baffled than the humans. They were called to the Council's central chamber, summoned for questioning. When the human representatives arrived, they were noticeably embarrassed but also confused. They had never imagined their film could cause such a catastrophic reaction. "We thought you'd find it spooky fun," one human said, scratching his head. His words hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. The Council's leaders exchanged glances, each still struggling to make sense of the situation. They had never encountered a race capable of causing such extreme emotional reactions, let alone creating entertainment based on fear. "You watch this for fun?" one delegate from the Zarnax system asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The humans shrugged awkwardly, unsure how to explain the concept of enjoying fear. It's just entertainment," another human said, though their tone was far from confident now. They had expected the aliens to react with curiosity, maybe even a little fright, not full-blown psychological distress. The Council did not know whether to reprimand the humans or conduct further studies, but there was no doubt that something had to be done. An emergency order was passed. Psychological evaluations of humanity were to be conducted immediately. A team of galactic psychiatrists and emotional analysts worked overtime, studying the humans' responses to their own creations. Their findings were nothing short of remarkable. "Extreme imaginative tolerance," the report read, "enjoys fear recreationally." It was a concept the Council had never encountered before. Humans, it seemed, were not just afraid of the dark, they welcomed it. The results were flagged for further investigation, and whispers began to circulate among some of the more curious Council members. "They don't scare, they laugh at terror?" one delegate from the Omnix clan asked in disbelief. The notion was so foreign that it took time for the others to grasp its full meaning. Was humanity truly capable of experiencing fear without crumbling under its weight? Was the human mind, in fact, stronger than any other species had ever imagined? The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. Meanwhile, the humans, who had once been proud of their horror genre, were now beginning to realize that perhaps their definition of fun was a little more extreme than they'd thought. As the therapy sessions continued, reports came in from all corners of the galaxy. More and more species were signing up for fear therapy, eager to see what could be learned. From humans' strange resilience Some began to experiment with their own versions of scary entertainment, though nothing seemed to compare to the brutal, chilling suspense of the human horror film. The Cephalians, having finally regained their composure, were left with lingering questions. Could they learn from humanity's ability to endure fear? Or was it something that simply didn't belong in their culture? The Nebula Choir pondered the same question, their once peaceful existence now tinged with the unsettling idea that perhaps there was a value in embracing terror. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, the aliens were struggling to understand a race they had once deemed simple and primitive. Humans had become an enigma, one that had, through their strange love of fear, captured the curiosity of the entire galaxy. As the chaotic recovery efforts continued, with therapists working tirelessly to soothe the shattered minds of the galaxy's delegates, one alien dared to ask a question no one else had considered. Veluni, a skilled and brave therapist from the Arcanos species, had spent weeks observing the aftermath of the shadows below. While most were still in a state of disbelief and trauma, she began to see something different in the humans who had created such a spectacle. What if, instead of erasing this strange resilience, they studied it? What if they could understand why humans could endure fear as a form of entertainment? Veluni's question lingered in the air like a spark waiting to ignite a fire. Her idea was radical, a complete turnabout from the initial desire to remove all traces of human horror from the galaxy. But after weeks of recovery and reflection, the Council was willing to entertain the possibility of a new perspective. So, the Human Fear Tolerance Study was born. Veluni began to assemble a team of open-minded individuals, both from the Council and from various species, to study humanity's ability to embrace terror without breaking. The first step was simple. They would watch human horror films, but this time, it would be under clinical supervision. The goal wasn't to be entertained, but to understand the physiological and emotional responses humans had to fear. The room filled with a mix of eager curiosity and cautious skepticism as the first film was projected. This time, the lights were on, the audience was calm, and the analysis began. Delegates sat, carefully observing the human reactions on screen, while Veluni and her team took notes, recorded data, and began to measure the emotional responses of each species involved. It wasn't long before the first subtle shift began to occur. What had once been purely terrifying to the aliens now seemed different. They began to notice things, the way humans would flinch, but then laugh. How they would scream, only to cheer moments later. It wasn't a breakdown, it wasn't weakness. It was something else entirely. Slowly, the therapeutic atmosphere around the films began to change. The delegates, still unsure of what to make of this, started to engage with the horror in a way they never had before. They weren't running from it. Instead, they were trying to understand it. They were studying fear, as one might study any other emotion, trying to peel back its layers. And to the shock of many, some aliens began to develop a strange, unexpected appreciation for it. A Cephalian poet, known for his deep emotional wisdom, sat quietly during one of the sessions, then suddenly began scribbling furiously on his datapad. By the end of the day, he had composed an entire sonnet inspired by the feelings of dread and awe he'd experienced watching The Thing. "The shadows call, and I am drawn," the sonnet began, speaking of fear not as a source of terror, but as something beautiful, even captivating. Meanwhile, a Kralaxian painter, who had once shied away from anything remotely unpleasant, created an entire gallery based on nightmare-themed art. The paintings, though dark and unsettling, were mesmerizing. Dark swirls and eerie figures that captured the essence of human horror films. To the surprise of many, she loved it. The process of creation, born out of fear, had opened up a new world of artistic expression for her. Word of these new artistic revelations spread quickly through the galaxy. A strange, fascinating thing had happened. Humanity's ability to face fear had become a source of inspiration. The emotions that were once seen as a weakness were now being admired, even emulated. Creatures from different planets began exploring their own perceptions of fear, creating their own unique expressions based on the way humans experienced it. The Kralaxians, once terrified by the concept of horror, began exploring the genre in their own art, and the Cephalians, who had once been terrified of the shadows below, began writing poems about the beautiful terror that lurked in the darkness. Even the Nebula Choir, who had once avoided any association with fear, started composing eerie melodies that captured the tension and unease of human horror, blending it with their own ethereal sounds. For the first time in history, the galaxy was united not by peaceful entertainment or harmonious beauty, but by the raw, unsettling power of fear. Humanity had unintentionally become the artistic inspiration for a generation of intergalactic creators. What had begun as a disastrous, horrifying cultural exchange had blossomed into something completely unexpected. An appreciation for the strange resilience of humanity and the depth of emotion that fear could unlock in the minds of those who could withstand it. And so, as the stars shimmered outside the council chamber, the galaxy had changed. What had once been feared as a weapon of psychological destruction had now become a new form of art. And humanity, with its deep well of resilience, had unknowingly opened the doors to a new era of intergalactic creativity. Months after the human fear tolerance study began, the unexpected happened. The Galactic Council, once stunned and horrified by humanity's horror films, now officially declared Earth's horror genre a misunderstood masterpiece of cultural strength. The decision was not made lightly. Many species who had once recoiled in terror now regarded humans with a strange mix of admiration and awe. It was no longer just the horror films themselves that fascinated the galaxy, but the human's ability to face fear, to not only withstand it, but to revel in it. To the Cephalians, known for their deep emotional sensitivity, the concept of inviting fear in seemed almost unnatural. But it was a reality they had come to accept, and slowly even admire. The Cephalian ambassador, who had once been one of the most vocal critics of Earth's so-called psychological weaponry, now stood before the council, calm but with a spark of respect in his voice. "Humanity does not fear the dark. They invite it in and give it popcorn," he said, his words filled with awe. The council, which had once been a bastion of calm and measured thought, now looked at humans as something entirely different. They were not just survivors, they were conquerors of the mind, brave enough to face their darkest fears and share them with the galaxy. Humanity, as it turned out, had become the galaxy's cultural apex predators. Their resilience had become a new kind of strength, one that transcended mere survival. As a result, the Earth was awarded a prestigious new role within the galactic community: Galactic Emotional Training Instructors. This new position wasn't just ceremonial, it came with a heavy responsibility. Humans were now entrusted with training the galaxy's most emotionally sensitive species in the art of fear: resistance. Their films, those once thought to be destructive and chaotic, were now used in controlled therapy settings to help species overcome their deepest fears. Alien therapists were even incorporating Earth's horror into their training programs, teaching their clients how to face their darkest emotions, just as humans had done for centuries. In some cases, Earth's horror genre had become the foundation of stress resistance training, helping species like the Kralaxians and Cephalians withstand overwhelming emotional experiences. It was a tool to strengthen their minds, to help them endure moments of fear without succumbing to panic. But the most shocking application came with the rise of alien thrill-seeking tours. These tours, designed for the most adventurous species, took them on journeys where they could safely experience fear in its most intense form. The human films, with their shocking twists and nail-biting tension, were used as the entertainment for these tours. The once timid and terrified delegates were now eager participants, seeking out the very fear that had once nearly destroyed them. It was a new era, one where humanity, with its seemingly boundless resilience, had become the source of strength for an entire galaxy. No longer were they seen as primitive or emotional beings. They were now the guides, the instructors, the masters of the emotional landscape. Earth's reputation had been completely transformed. But, as the galaxy reveled in its newfound respect for humanity, one thing remained: the mystery of how far humanity's resilience could go. Somewhere, in the quiet shadows of Earth's creative studios, a human director was already planning the next step. "Wait till they see the sequel," he whispered to himself, the glint of mischief in his eyes. The aliens, though captivated by the original horror films, had no idea that humanity's next creation would push the limits of fear even further. And in the stars, where creatures once feared the very idea of human terror, a quiet, almost excited anticipation began to grow. The galaxy had learned to face fear, but they had no idea that humanity was preparing to show them a new level of it.